It is a great honor and pleasure for all of us to have a very distinguished guest with us today, His Excellency John Howard, former Prime Minister of Australia. He will talk today about the bright future of Australian-Korean relations. Well, of course, our relations are already bright, but should be brighter. Australia and Korea have maintained a very close cooperative relationship ever since Australia dispatched its troops to help South Korea against the North Korean invasion in the Korean War. Last year, I had a chance to visit Canberra, and I stopped before the very beautiful Korean War Memorial, and I really thought about the sacrifice of the former Australian soldiers who fell during the war, and I really felt gratitude. Not only have our two countries pursued remarkably similar foreign policy goals based upon common values, but also we were able to establish and develop close economic relations thanks to economic complementarity of our two countries. As a result, Korea now occupies the position of the fourth largest trading partner of Australia, while Australia is the eighth trading partner of Korea in terms of bilateral trade volume. Not content with the current status of Australia-Korea partnership, however, I would like to emphasize that there lies ahead even more for both countries to work together. I firmly believe that the two countries, as middle powers in the rising Asia-Pacific region, need to fully and intensely cooperate, not simply at the regional, but further on the global level, firmly based upon our shared political and economic values. In this light, I'm very glad that Korea and Australia are about to open a chapter in our bilateral partnership as we have started FTA negotiations in May this year. I believe we are very fortunate to have this opportunity at this critical juncture to invite His Excellency John Howard to address the future of Australian-Korean relationship. I truly hope today's Korea Foundation Forum will provide good chances for all of us to ponder over the future of the two middle powers and explore into what specifically should be done to make it more promising. As you may well know, Prime Minister John Howard served as the 25th Prime Minister of Australia from 1996 to 2007 for almost 12 years, being re-elected through the 1998, 2001, and 2004 elections. During his premiership, he presided over a long period of Australia's strong economic growth and prosperity. I may say Prime Minister Howard is Australia's living political legend, as he was the second longest serving Prime Minister after Sir Robert Menzies. Now, on behalf of the Korea Foundation, it is my great pleasure to present to you Prime Minister John Howard, the 25th Prime Minister of Australia. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President, for that very warm welcome. I acknowledge the presence of the Ambassador of my own country, Ambassador Georgievich from Australia, His Excellency the Ambassador from the Republic of India, the distinguished Congresswoman who's going to visit Australia. We wish her well on her journey. Other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to be back here in Seoul, to be back here in Korea. I want to this morning address some remarks to the relationship between our two countries, but to put that relationship in the context of the circumstances of our region and most particularly the economic circumstances of the world. You were kind enough, sir, in your introduction to refer to the contribution made by Australia to the defence of your country all those years ago in the Korean War. I was just about to turn 11 when the Korean War commenced in June of 1950. And as a consequence, somebody even at that age very interested in current affairs, spurred by a family that was interested, I followed those events very, very closely. And I therefore had indelibly imprinted on my mind the divisions between the two Koreas, the names of Seoul and Incheon and Taegu and Pyongyang were names that I absorbed very, very early in my career. And I have therefore followed my life, rather. It wasn't a career at the age of 10, I can assure you. I therefore have followed the fortunes of your country with very particular interest. And as somebody in his post-active political days still retains the chairmanship of the International Democratic Union, which is a worldwide organisation to which centre-right political parties around the world belong, and the IDU is always on the lookout for new recruits to its membership ranks. Can I simply say that I admire, amongst the many things that your country has achieved, I admire enormously the struggle that you have successfully undertaken to build a viable democracy. You have paid a very heavy price. We who come from nations that take democracy for granted and have never known anything else should always acknowledge the extraordinary sacrifice of people who've done so much to achieve democracy. And in the time that I was Prime Minister, I was reflecting earlier that my time as Prime Minister neatly encompassed the two respective 5-year terms of the two preceding Korean presidents. And I particularly am conscious of the extraordinary contribution that President Kim Dae-jung made, often at enormous personal suffering and consequence, the contribution that he made to the building and development of democracy in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, it's impossible to go anywhere in the world, and particularly if you are a serving leader or a former leader, go anywhere in the world now without saying something about what's become, in the colloquialism of our time, the global financial crisis. I don't want to spend an enormous amount talking about this morning, except to again contextualise it to Korea. There's a great deal of debate, inevitably, about the causes of the global financial crisis or plunge or downturn or meltdown, whatever description you want to use. Somebody remarked to me the other day that it's going to nourish the economics profession and the economics faculty for the next 20 or 30 years, and there'll be so many textbooks produced on it that the profession will be kept very busy. They're still writing books about the causes of the Great Depression in the 1930s, so there's no reason why you haven't got 20 or 30 years of work for the economics profession. But I think one of the things that we must avoid in looking back at the causes, and there will be legitimate debate and there'll be proper argument within our respective societies as to whether the regulatory systems, not only of the United States but also other countries, responded adequately. There'll be debate about the contribution that was made, especially in the United States, by the practice of making loans available to people who from the very beginning had no capacity to repay those loans and to meet the obligations on those loans. All of that will be a legitimate part of the debate. But I do hope that the debate does not make the error of overlooking the enormous contribution that globalisation, based on essentially a free market approach to economic management, has made to the growth and the development of the world, particularly the developing world, over the last 30 years. And that, of course, brings me to your own country, Korea. I won't be saying it for the first time. Others who may have heard me speak on this subject before will perhaps remember that I have frequently said, and I believe it very strongly, that there is no better example in the world, of the benefits of globalisation and going from an essentially closed, restricted economic approach to a more open one, of the benefits of that than has been displayed by Korea over the last 30 years. Because the economic growth and development of this country over that period of time, the stunning achievement of going from an economy which, 30 to 40 years ago, was ranked below Zambia and Pakistan, to now being the 14th largest economy in the world, and of course from Australia's point of view, a nation of growing export contribution, not only in goods but also in services. It is a very remarkable achievement. So as the world, and most particularly we in our own region here in the Asia-Pacific region, look at the causes of what's happened, we try and understand why it occurred, we try and understand the contributions that different philosophies have made to where we are. Let us not forget that the world now, compared with the world 30 years ago, is a wealthier, more prosperous, more successful, with fewer people living in poverty, and the contribution that has been made by globalisation, as so, I think, remarkably demonstrated here in Korea, the contribution that's been made by globalisation to lifting the largest number of people out of poverty that has been in a measured period in human history. It's a very, very remarkable contribution. So I am very much of the view that the world has a responsibility, and it obviously falls very heavily on those who are now in government. The world has a responsibility to try and understand the reasons why we've had the economic difficulties of recent times. But in the process of doing that, let us not for one moment forget the huge contribution made by globalisation and open markets to the prosperity of the world, and most particularly, and it is the best example I can find anywhere in the world, the contribution that has been made by Korea. Let me say that Australia has followed the economic fortunes of Korea very closely over the last 30 years. We have seen our trade grow, we have seen the enormous contribution of the industrialisation of Korea to the Australian economy, the growing demand for our natural resources. But it's not only been in the area of natural resources where that growth has occurred. There's been a tremendous growth in the service sector of our economy. I understand that it's the third largest source after China and India of students to Australian educational institutions. The growth of Australian financial organisations here in Korea. So it is a relationship that is not just built on the appetite of Korean industry for Australian mineral resources. It is a relationship which is much wider and much more diverse than that. It is, of course, also a relationship that, importantly, been built on people-to-people links. There is a very, very significant Korean community in Australia, a community that's making a very big contribution to our country. The electorate that I used to represent in federal parliament had one of the largest Korean Australian populations of any part of Sydney, and I think any part of Australia. And I got to know that community very well, and I got to know its contribution not only to that area of Sydney, but also Australia more generally. So it is a relationship that's built on history. It's a relationship that has been built very much over the last 30 to 40 years on trade and on people-to-people exchanges, but it's also a relationship that's been built very, very much on shared values. When countries cooperate and go to war together, when they fight for a common ideal, it does leave a very strong legacy. And the legacy of commitment to freedom and commitment to democracy, which has grown out of the Australian-Korean relationship, is an extremely important one. Quite properly, successive Australian governments, whatever their political stripe, have invested enormous significance in the growth and the development of relations with the countries of our region. It's no exaggeration, indeed, it's become a cliche to say that the Asia-Pacific region is the fastest growing region in the world. But in saying that, we should not in any way underestimate just how important that is to the future of both our countries. By the year 2030, the majority of what could be called the middle class of the world will live in the Asia-Pacific region. And that will be the first time that it will be possible to say that since the Industrial Revolution. And that does represent an extraordinary transformation for mankind. And it represents an extraordinary challenge and an extraordinary opportunity for those of us who are placed in that part of the world. And Australian governments, and certainly the one I led, and I know the one that went before me and the one that's come after me, are very, very conscious of the significance of those links. And in a sense, Australia and Korea epitomise, perhaps better than any other two countries, epitomise the significance of that transformation. We tend to use in international language, we tend to use words like big and small, develop and developing, and then if you can't quite work out where you want to locate a country, you use the expression middle. Now, I think it's fair to say that Australia is not a big country population-wise, although it is a big country area-wise, but it's a country that has succeeded over the years, I believe, in punching above her weight in so many areas. We find ourselves very much comfortably accepting the role of a middle power. We are a Western nation, we have a long tradition of democracy. Our relationship with the United States is based on common values and remains, of course, far and away our most important relationship. But we have a growing set of relationships in our own region which are based on common democratic principles. I notice that the Ambassador of India is here, the largest democracy in the world. That hasn't quite enhanced its cricket playing capacity to the extent that one might expect, but they're on their way. And can I also say that Japan, a nation that all of us in the past have been in conflict with, and of course Australia and the United States and Korea. And what is the thing that binds those countries together more than anything else? And the thing that binds those countries together, of course, is a common commitment to the democratic way of life. That doesn't mean to say that democracies don't seek to have a proper basis of cooperation with countries that aren't democracies. Australia has a very valuable but very pragmatic relationship with China. China is Australia's largest export destination and a very valuable customer. But I frequently said when I was Prime Minister, and I have no reason to think otherwise now, that Australians should always base their relationship with China on pragmatic shared interests. And we must understand that China is a very different society from Australia. It's a very different society from Korea, and it is from India, and it is from the United States, because it is not based on the great democratic ideals that our societies and our nations share in common. So as I analyse the relationship between our two countries, I draw not only on the history, I draw not only on the trade, I draw not only on the people-to-people links, but I draw very heavily on the common commitment to democracy. It's not, of course, realistic of anybody like me to come to Seoul without saying something about the relationship between your country and North Korea. Let me say that I acknowledge the pragmatism and the common sense that's been displayed recently by the United States and North Korea in relation to the release of those two journalists. I'm always a great believer in outbreaks of common sense and pragmatic exchanges based on mutual interest, and where that can be achieved, it ought to be embraced and ought to be undertaken. But I don't think anybody should underestimate the task that still lies ahead. I think the approach being taken by your own President is the right approach. I think the maintenance of a commitment to the six-party talks, it's essential in dealing with North Korea that we continue to engage the attention of the Chinese, because however much they may disavow it, in the ultimate, no country has a greater influence on North Korea than does China. And it's the obligation of all of us. I certainly undertook it when I was Prime Minister, and I'm sure my successor is doing exactly the same thing, and that is continuing to encourage China to exert as much pressure as possible on North Korea to disavow her nuclear ambitions. Whether that will be achieved and whether it is realistic to expect it to be achieved is something that will remain. It's, of course, is the biggest single diplomatic and strategic challenge that your country has, and I can only say that the way in which your President has approached it certainly enjoys a lot of support and a great deal of respect around the world. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, can I just say again how much I've enjoyed coming back to your country. I've admired its progress. I respect its long and sometimes agonising and difficult commitment to democracy, the way in which it has embraced the benefits of globalisation to the enormously beneficial outcomes of so many of your citizens is something that I respect and admire very much. I think I have indicated the strength of my own commitment, and I think I speak for most Australians in saying that we value this relationship. It's one that has developed in the lifetime of a generation, and it's one of which all of us should be very proud. Thank you.